The moment the message reached her, everything reportedly froze. Not just the room, not just the air, but the illusion she had been clinging to for years. Because this wasn't another ignored invitation or quiet snub buried under polite diplomatic smiles. This was Italy itself, the kingdom of couture, the cathedral of legacy, the empire of elegance, allegedly delivering a cold, unmistakable signal that Meghan Markle was not welcome in Milan. And insiders swear the shock of that rejection didn't just bruise her ego, it detonated something deeper, something raw, something she could no longer spin, charm, or repackage into victimhood. Because this time there was no stage, no microphone, no Netflix lens to soften the blow, just a closed door bolted from the inside. For years, Meghan had carefully crafted the image of the unstoppable disruptor, the woman who broke royal chains and stepped into global influence with fearless independence. But behind the scenes, whispers had been growing louder, sharper, more uncomfortable, whispers that she wasn't breaking barriers anymore, she was burning bridges. And Milan, the crown jewel of fashion power, had allegedly been watching everything, quietly, patiently, calculating whether letting her enter their sacred fashion sanctum would elevate their prestige or contaminate it with chaos. And according to those watching from behind velvet curtains, the answer came swiftly, brutally, and without apology. Because Milan isn't Hollywood, Milan doesn't care about emotional interviews or carefully rehearsed confessions. Milan remembers loyalty, discipline, hierarchy, and respect. And insiders claim the stories drifting across Europe about Meghan's alleged attempts to appear at elite fashion events without formal invitations had already raised alarms, not just as breaches of etiquette, but as signals of something far more dangerous: unpredictability. And unpredictability is the one currency Milan refuses to trade in, no matter how famous the face attached to it. They say when the final internal discussions happened, there was no dramatic shouting, no explosive arguments, just cold agreement. The kind that settles over a room when everyone already knows the truth but doesn't want to say it out loud. And according to those familiar with the decision, security teams were allegedly instructed in advance, quietly but firmly, that if Meghan attempted to attend certain high-profile events, she would not be granted entry. No exceptions, no special considerations, no royal nostalgia to shield her from the reality she had spent years trying to outrun. And that's when something shifted, because this wasn't just about fashion anymore. This was about identity, about power, about whether the woman who once stood beside the British throne could still command the same global reverence she once effortlessly absorbed. And sources close to elite fashion circles allegedly describe the sentiment as exhaustion, not hatred, not anger, but exhaustion from the constant gravitational pull of controversy that seemed to follow her everywhere she went, turning every appearance into spectacle instead of celebration. What made the situation even more explosive was the timing, because behind the glamour and carefully curated public appearances, Meghan's empire had reportedly been showing cracks. The deals that once symbolized independence and victory had quietly faded, the momentum had slowed, and the narrative she once controlled so masterfully had begun slipping through her fingers, piece by piece, leaving her in a dangerous position where visibility no longer guaranteed admiration, sometimes it guaranteed rejection. And insiders claim that when word of Milan's position reached her, it wasn't just the rejection that stung, it was what the rejection represented: the collapse of an assumption she had built her post-royal life around, the assumption that global influence would always remain within reach, that the doors opened by her royal association would never fully close, even after she had publicly severed herself from the institution that gave her that power in the first place. Because Milan wasn't just saying no to Meghan Markle the celebrity, Milan was allegedly saying no to the entire narrative she had spent years constructing, the narrative of reinvention, resilience, and unstoppable ascent. And that kind of rejection doesn't just echo through headlines, it echoes through identity itself, forcing questions that no publicist can answer and no interview can erase. Meanwhile, observers began noticing subtle signs of strain, the kind that doesn't scream but whispers: fewer high-profile appearances, fewer triumphant headlines, fewer moments where she stood at the center of admiration instead of scrutiny. And the silence from elite European fashion houses was louder than any statement could ever be, because silence in those circles isn't neutrality, it's strategy. Some insiders claim the concern wasn't just about reputation, it was about control, about whether inviting Meghan meant inviting a story they couldn't contain, a spotlight they couldn't redirect, a narrative that would ultimately belong to her instead of them, and Milan fiercely protective of. Its legacy allegedly chose preservation over risk, history over headlines, stability over spectacle. And somewhere behind closed doors, far from flashing cameras and public statements, the reality reportedly settled in with terrifying clarity that reinvention only works when the world agrees to play along. And Milan, for reasons both whispered and unspoken, had chosen not to, because this wasn't just another rejection. This was a signal that the world she had once commanded without resistance was no longer guaranteed. A signal that influence, once lost, doesn't return just because you demand it. A signal that the empire she built after walking away from royalty was standing on ground far less stable than anyone had publicly admitted. And the most devastating part wasn't the warning itself. It was the silence that followed it. The silence that told her everything she needed to know. What made the Milan warning even more explosive wasn't just the rejection itself, it was what insiders claim happened immediately after. Because according to those close to elite European fashion circles, Meghan didn't simply accept the reality quietly and retreat into dignified silence. No, the emotional fallout reportedly ignited behind closed doors, where disbelief turned into fury, and fury turned into something far more dangerous: desperation. The kind that creeps in when someone realizes the world they thought they controlled has begun slipping out of their hands. One country, one brand, one invitation at a time. Because Milan wasn't supposed to be the enemy, Milan was supposed to be the next stage in her reinvention. The next carefully chosen backdrop where she could reemerge not as the controversial exile from royalty, but as the unstoppable global icon she had always envisioned herself becoming. Draped in Italian couture, photographed beneath cathedral ceilings of influence, reclaiming the narrative that had slowly turned against her, but instead she allegedly found herself facing something she hadn't prepared for: refusal without negotiation. And insiders say the real shock wasn't just the refusal itself, it was the coldness of it, the lack of hesitation, the absence of diplomatic softness that usually protects figures of her stature from outright humiliation. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding, this wasn't a scheduling conflict. This was reportedly deliberate, calculated, and final, a preemptive move designed to prevent chaos before it even had the chance to arrive. For someone who had spent years mastering the art of public perception, of turning criticism into sympathy and rejection into empowerment, this kind of immovable barrier presented a terrifying challenge, because you can't spin a door that never opens, you can't rewrite a narrative that refuses to. Include you. And insiders claim that realization hit harder than any tabloid headline ever could. And the whispers didn't stop there, because behind the scenes, fashion executives and cultural gatekeepers across Europe were allegedly watching closely, observing not just Milan's decision but Meghan's reaction to it, measuring whether she would respond with quiet dignity or escalate the situation into yet another public spectacle. Because in elite circles, reactions matter just as much as actions, and one wrong move can confirm fears that had previously existed only as speculation. Meanwhile, the ripple effects reportedly began spreading beyond fashion into the broader ecosystem of influence she had spent years trying to dominate. Because brands don't operate in isolation, they observe each other, they learn from each other, and when one major cultural capital takes a stand, others often follow, not out of cruelty but out of caution, because association is currency and no one wants to invest in uncertainty. Behind the walls of her carefully curated life, sources claimed the pressure had been building long before Milan delivered its warning. The slow collapse of high-profile deals, the fading momentum, the growing realization that attention alone wasn't enough to sustain influence forever. And now, with one of the world's most prestigious fashion capitals allegedly drawing a line, the illusion of unlimited reinvention was facing its most brutal test yet. And then there was Harry, reportedly caught in the crossfire of a reality neither of them had fully anticipated, because leaving the royal institution had been framed as liberation, as escape, as the beginning of a new empire built on independence and authenticity. But independence comes with a price, and insiders claim that price had begun to feel heavier with every closed door, every unanswered call, every moment where the world didn't respond the way they expected it to. Because rejection doesn't just exist in public, it exists in silence, in the subtle shifts, in the invitations that never arrive, in the partnerships that quietly dissolve without explanation, in the growing distance between who you were were and who the world now sees you as, and Milan's warning wasn't just an isolated moment, it was allegedly part of a larger pattern that had been unfolding slowly, almost invisibly, until it could no longer be ignored. And perhaps the most devastating part wasn't the external rejection at all, it was the internal realization that the strategy she had relied on for years, the strategy of controlling her narrative, of staying ahead of criticism, of transforming controversy into opportunity, was no longer delivering the same results, because narratives require audiences willing to believe them, and belief, once fractured, is painfully difficult to restore. Observers began noticing the subtle signs, the carefully managed appearances designed to project confidence while rumors swirled beneath the surface, the quiet attempts to maintain relevance in an ecosystem that was becoming increasingly indifferent, and insiders claimed that behind the scenes, the question wasn't just about Milan anymore, it was about everything, about the future, about relevance, about whether the empire she had built could survive without the foundation it was originally built upon. Because influence isn't permanent, it's borrowed, and when the world decides to reclaim it, there's no negotiation, there's only reality. And Milan, with its quiet but unmistakable warning, had reportedly forced Meghan Markle to confront a reality she had spent years trying to outrun. That reinvention has limits, that power has conditions, and that even the most carefully constructed narratives can collapse when the world stops believing in them. The woman who once walked beside royalty now stood at the edge of something far more uncertain, facing doors that no longer opened on command, facing a world that no longer reacted with automatic admiration, facing the terrifying possibility that the greatest challenge of her life wasn't escaping the monarchy, it was surviving without it. And somewhere, beneath the headlines, beneath the whispers, beneath the carefully maintained public image, one question lingered, heavier than all the rest. Not whether Milan rejected her, but whether Milan was only the beginning. Milan was only the beginning. Milan was only the beginning. Milan was